everybody. Thank you for joining tonight. My name is Ron Robertson. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Picmonic. And, I actually started Picmonic as a third-year medical student after I had taken step one. And so to some extent, I understand the pain firsthand of trying to become a healthcare professional and how much information you have to learn and retain, and a lot of the daunting challenges of becoming a doctor. And my problem was definitely remembering the information, which is what led to the creation of Picmonic, using pictures and stories to help me retain the information. And that, fast forward now 7 years, I'm kind of at the helm and lead Picmonic's mission to help students make learning the impossible possible. Now, that's just a very small glimpse into kind of who I am and why I'm here. But today, it's an honor to present and have an opportunity to chat with Kristin. So Chris, welcome and thank you for joining.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So before we jump in, Chris, where did you go to medical school? Where are you right now in residency? Just catch people up to speed real quick on some of those details.
Yeah, sure. So from New York originally, I did medical school at Albert Einstein in the Bronx, New York. And now I'm up at Yale New Haven Hospital in Connecticut for pediatric residency. So I'm a third-year resident, about to finish. And I'll be going on to a clinical informatics fellowship 2 years down at Sinai in Manhattan.
Which is phenomenal. So congrats to your success thus far. First and foremost about step one. It's kind of the beast, right, of medical school. You get in, and the first couple of years, it's the looming giant. So tell me a little bit about your experience with step one.
Yeah, so for, just to normalize it, step one is pretty much the worst part of medical school, so don't feel bad if you guys are struggling or freaking out. It's totally normal, and just take a breath because everyone gets through it. So for me, it was really helpful so our medical school had something called the Step 1 group, which was a peer-run organization. It was older students who would help the younger students who were about to take the exam. It would give them sort of objective advice and study strategies. So we had that in place, which was super helpful. And I'll be speaking a lot through that lens because I ended up being one of the co-leaders during my third and fourth year, and we ended up developing a pretty extensive sort of study strategy, I guess you'd call it, program. And with the school, we ended up studying our results. So we got, numbers of all the medical students, anonymized what their medical school test scores were, what their step one scores were, what types of resources they used for step one, and when they started. So lots of different information. And we were able to look at all that and figure out what seems to be working best for people and what doesn't. So that's sort of where I came from after going through it myself, and then sort of moving into more of a teaching position and an analytical position of trying to find out what works, what strategies work best, and what to focus on.
So let's make sure that everybody understands what we just said. Number one, you nailed step one. You got a 268, which is phenomenal. But then you actually helped to lead the peer group at your institution, at your medical school, that helped to make recommendations to other students, but did this in an analytical way, actually doing research around step one test scores. So numerous different points here, and that research was published, right? You can actually we can actually share that afterwards as well. But so let's break it down. And maybe we can run this in parallel based on the recommendations of the research that you guys published, but also kind of how you took this down yourself and through your journey. What did you actually do? Let's start with, when did you start studying for STEP?
So I started a little bit earlier just because I didn't really know what to expect, as a second year. Obviously I was nervous. So I probably started looking into Q banks and stuff around October, November. But, not really committing to it, being very inconsistent with my work. But, I would try to do, like, I don't know, 3 or 4 questions a night, like nothing significant. And then really started ramping up around January. And then it sort of comes in phases with your classwork. So I would, I recommend definitely prioritizing classwork as well. So I would study a little less for STEP during, January to March. Then once spring break hit, I amped up a little bit more. Then slowed down again, and then finally our school had a dedicated study period, towards the end, and obviously you're doing a lot more studying at that point.
So, and when did you actually take your exam? Because I know a lot of institutions take them at different points in time. So, was yours like a May, June timeframe, or?
Yeah, it's like a mid June. I think it was like June 20th or something.
Okay. And how long was that dedicated step time? How many weeks did you actually go intensive studying?
So the dedicated was about 6 weeks, but I was probably pushing myself for, I would say, the last like 8 weeks, or 8 to 10 weeks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And so you said you actually started doing question banks in October, November, December, and kind of lightly ramped up. So first semester, second year, lightly ramped up on the Q banks. So tell me a little bit about the question banks that you used in your journey.
Cool. So in terms of Q banks, I stuck with. So first, I actually got Kaplan. I ended up focusing heavily on UWorld, and then beyond those were the main two that I used, and our school had some less useful ones that were free that I didn't do much with. So I focused heavily on UWorld, and then secondarily on Kaplan. And then in terms of what my recommendations are as a mentor, I pretty much highly recommend UWorld as the #1 resource. So it's super high yield. The explanations are amazing. I tell students to sort of treat the explanations like its own textbook. So if you imagine all the explanations combined, it's basically another textbook, and the explanations are so good. The way the questions are written, the stuff you'll see, it's very high yield, and there's obviously some medium and low mixed in, but overall, in my opinion, it's the highest yield resource. One goal I suggest to students is, as much as you can, try to finish UWorld 2 times through. And it's super daunting, it's really scary, but the closer you can get to that 2 times through, the more you're going to retain all those questions. The first pass through is sort of overwhelming, a lot of information, but that second pass through really starts to solidify what you learned, and also you're not struggling through those explanations as much anymore. And then in terms of, I get obviously asked a lot about other Q banks, and in my opinion, after UWorld, like prioritize UWorld, and then after that, I would only pick maybe one other Q bank and stick with that. I don't recommend any one in particular, whichever one to you seems the most relevant to the UWorld content, but pick one other one, and then once you've finished as much UWorld as you think is good for you, then I would move on to that secondary one, but only after you feel pretty comfortable with the UWorld content. So that's usually what I recommend.
I have to ask too, because I hear a lot of people saying that they'll do Kaplan in, let's say, the first half of second year, even first year leading up to second year, and then really in the 6 months before step time, that they'll really focus on UWorld. So you're saying, crush UWorld once, do it again, and if you have time, maybe throw in a third or a second Q bank, but really focus heavily on UWorld.
So the first big thing we saw was that January seemed to be the sweet spot for starting step prep. Students who started earlier didn't score better than the students who started in January, and the ones who started later potentially were doing a bit worse. So January really seemed to be that sweet spot.
Okay, that's good.
And then another big thing we found was that number of questions completed seemed to be one of the most important predictors of score. So you could look at students who did, all of UWorld and then 1,000 or more extra questions, or UWorld and 1,000 less questions. And those kids who had a higher number of questions tended to do better. So, and other people have looked at this before as well. So it's unclear if it's what the specific questions are, where they come from, or if it's just sheer number of questions, but getting through those questions is super important.
And how many questions did you do? Just so for context, you said you did UWorld twice, so we're saying like there's 2,000 questions, ends up being like 4,000 questions total, or?
Yeah, so 4,000 total, and you end up, honestly, on that second run through, you're usually going pretty quick. So you're cutting your time down on a block to like 30 minutes to an hour. You're skipping a lot of easy questions, so you're breezing through. So it's not nearly as painful as the first time.
Okay. And the only other thing that I want to kind of elicit with this too, at least talking about question banks, is the well, this kind of ties to time management and stamina as well, but were you doing, especially leading up in your dedicated step prep time, were you doing chunks of, 45, 45, 45? Uh, how many actual sets of questions were you doing leading up to it? Did you take many
So
full-length practice exams in the form of Q banks?
yeah. All super common questions that we get a lot. I'll just quickly, for the standardized tests, or the prep tests, I actually only took one and I didn't find it very useful. It varies by students because some students really love it and they love the confidence. But for me, like the NBME ones that I've seen weren't nearly as predictive of what the test was like as even UWorld itself. So for me, I still just recommend focusing on the UWorld, but some students really like the practice test, so I don't really comment one way or another. I just say like try one and see if you like it. And then the other question about doing blocks. So I would typically sit down and do blocks in a row, and I recommend that, it's always good to just sit down and do the straight block. There's a lot of stuff to mention. So people ask a lot about how many blocks to do per day kind of thing. I usually say in January, in January, you're probably doing like, 20 questions a day, 10, 20 questions a day, starting real slow. By the dedicated study period, when you're trying to really go hard with UWorld, you're probably doing 3 or 4 blocks a day, and that's including like reading and studying explanation. So it's sort of time consuming.
Yeah. So I know there's other parts of question banks that I kind of want to tap into, but I want to do it in kind of concert with some of the other resources as well. So let's talk about some of the other key resources, and first just list them off, and then let's dive in a little bit to the different things that you use.
Sure. So we break it up by resource type. So first, we talk about textbooks. So obviously, first aid is like the holy grail. One piece of advice I give is it's only in your benefit to know as much of first aid as possible. And that's another really scary statement. And it's pretty much impossible is the kicker. But as much as you can get of that first aid in, it is a really high yield resource. So that's why I usually say prioritize. Yeah, it's impossible to do, but just always remembering that as much of that as you could get in, the better, and it's not even like a particularly well-written resource, but unfortunately they will, I've seen questions asked on a lot of the stuff in there. So as much as you can within reason, try to get as much first aid in as possible. So first aid's one text. There's like Pathoma text. Golion has a text which is a little too wordy and low yield, so I usually don't recommend that. The BRS series stuff I usually recommend just for students struggling with a particular subject, obviously. So I wouldn't recommend going through the whole series. I would just say, if you're having trouble with embryology, then pick up that one, but don't read a whole BRS book. Just read small sections. Then we talk about Q banks, which we already mentioned. I always focus on audio and visual resources as another category, which I think is maybe a little bit undervalued. So there's like Golion lectures, there's like the Pathoma lectures, and then what I love about Picmonic actually is we have educational audios for all of our Picmonics, which will just talk you through the educational parts of the Picmonic, and it has really great it's just high yield facts listed one after another. So having those audios to listen to when you're free time is super important, like washing the dishes or at the gym, just having something on in the background. You'll be surprised how much you actually end up retaining. And then the last thing would be like the commercial test prep products, like the DIT and stuff like that. We never really gave an opinion one way or another on those. It's sort of like those test prep MBME ones. Some people swear by it, some people it doesn't work for. So it's the sort of thing you got to do your research and talk to people and see if it's for you. But those are the
Okay,
big
so
categories.
okay, so let me jump in. So really, when we talk textbooks, we're looking at first aid as kind of the gold standard, right? We've got question banks, which we're saying UWorld, and then other resources or audiovisual resources where you mentioned kind of like Picmonic, which of the audiovisual resources did you use? Obviously, you used first aid for textbook.
Yeah.
What in the audiovisual realm did you use?
So I focused heavily on the Golion lectures, which
Yeah,
I don't even know if they're available for like purchase or if it's just sort of like handed between students, because that's how I got my
just
lectures
the
funded.
audio lectures, or was there actually videos?
Yeah, so the ones that we had circulating was just audio,
Yeah,
but
right.
the audio is all you need. But I have students who use the Pathoma videos and they'll just sort of listen to them. Um, but
Okay.
for me, it was the Golion in particular.
Okay. And so, did you actually use Picmonic for step one or step two?
Yeah, for both.
So tell me a little bit about your experience with Picmonic. It's funny. A lot of students when we talk to them, a lot of people use it very different. Whether they're using it with, let's say, to complement first aid, they're learning a topic in first aid, and then they're referencing, Picmonic actually has the pages listed of first aid. We reference first aid, so you could go to that topic and then watch the Picmonic, which is going to kind of place those memory anchors in your brain so that you have that bullet point list memorized, right? Versus other people will do questions, and if they get a question wrong, then they'll go to Picmonic to make sure that they lock that in. So how did you use Picmonic in your studies and in concert with some of these other resources?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that I love Picmonic, and the reason
Woo!
I'm here,
This isn't
the
a
reason I'm
shameless
here
plug.
right now. Yeah, no, I'm here right now. As you remember, I reached out to you last year, just because I love the product and I just wanted to get involved again. So I always recommend Picmonic when students ask me about advice. So basically, it's just even if you don't think you're an audiovisual learner, I always tell people to first just get on and get the free trial. And what I've said to myself when I was a second year student, I was a little bit skeptical and I was like, all right, I'll look at these like 10 Picmonics, and if I remember them next week, then I'm gonna buy the subscription. And
Yeah,
1 week later, of course, I remembered all of it and I was like, all right, I have to get it because it's just so efficient. Um, so I highly recommend it for all students at least to check out. And I think it'll work for a lot of people. I started using it throughout the whole school year, starting around in January, and I would use it with my classwork for if there was like a really difficult disease or difficult topic that I was having trouble with. And then I ramp up a lot when like during the spring break and during the dedicated period, I would have like just Picmonic time during the day. So probably like 30 minutes to an hour where I would just go through the really high yield Picmonic systems. And by that I mean
yeah. Let's
Picmonic
explain
for
that.
me is, yeah, so Picmonic for me is even more useful than anything else for the really nitpicky, really complex step one topics. So, you've got your like metabolic diseases, all those weird pediatric syndromes, genetic disorders. Then you've got pharmacology, microbiology. A lot of these topics that students have a lot of trouble remembering. They probably didn't hear much about it in their regular medical school courses.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there's just such a huge volume of information. It's really hard to commit all these tiny, nitpicky disorders to memory. So for me, I would always have Picmonic open studying those sections. And then any other section where I was having trouble with a particular topic or disorder, I'd be referencing it.
That's great. And definitely, I know, it's for me remembering the microbiology, a lot of pharmacology where it's not to say rote memorization, but it felt like rote memorization, and you're trying to keep those nuanced details. I've said this before, it's actually like the lysosomal storage diseases in biochem. That was the set of trying to remember sphingomyelinase, aryl sulfatase, beta-glucocerebrosidase. It was just like, there wasn't a lot of deep information there that we actually needed to know, but we had to know the nuanced facts. And so, actually
Exactly.
creating pictures in these stories made it, for me, incredibly simple, and that was kind of the impetus of starting Picmonic. But love to see that it worked. So you used Picmonic for step one, and so with first aid or with UWorld or with did you use Pathoma, or it was more Golion on
I
the
didn't
audio
use
side?
Pathoma actually. Yeah, it was Golion, but people have success with Pathoma too. So I never pick one or the other usually for when
Yeah,
I'm
yeah,
making
yeah.
recommendations.
And I have to ask because a lot of people think about most of these resources as just step one or test prep resources. Um, do you know, either did you or other students use Picmonic actually in first year? Because we hear a lot of students saying one of their biggest regrets is not using it earlier,
Hmm.
or that they actually end up using it into step two or even residency. Has it helped you in your journey and beyond? I mean, for where you're at now?
Oh yeah, for sure. I still, to this day, when I'm on the floors getting like pimped by someone, or I still remember the Picmonics in my head. And I'll go back and like refresh my memory because it's just the fastest way to remember. Students ask me a lot about using it in first year, and I always say just go for it. It's the same learning platform that it's going to be. If it's going to work for you, it's going to work, and it's
Right.
super efficient. So if there's relevant topics on there and you're struggling, earlier in med school, then yeah, go for it.
That's great. That's great advice. So, I mean, if we had to kind of consolidate some of this advice, and maybe even if, well, I kind of wanted to consolidate and say, so if you had to boil it down to a couple key tips, um, you know, use UWorlds, do it multiple times. First aid is obviously a core resource in the Bible. Try and memorize as much as possible. Use audio-visual resources or things that are going to help really supplement that learning and help you retain it. So, a Goliana, Pathoma, Picmonic. Um, what am I missing here? Give me some more advice that everyone, all our listeners, we got tons of people watching this now.
Yeah.
What else can they take away as kind of key points?
Yeah, so everything you said is right. Starting in January, I usually recommend starting slow and then ramping up during times when you
Saw
start slow, ramping up when you can, and then I give those goals that I mentioned, they're very intimidating and they're lofty, and you definitely don't have to get there, but it's sort of, that it's just a goal to have, and it's just an idea that something that you could try to get to, and if you can't make it there, that's fine, and the majority of people do perfectly fine without hitting those goals. So
Right.
um, what else? Don't forget about your regular schoolwork. So keep up with that during, the whole, January to June. If you, God forbid, if you fail a medical school test or you do real bad, that's going to cause you a lot of problems in the coming months that might detract from your step studying. So you really want to keep up with your classwork and with your other medical school duties. Um, we also looked at medical school test scores in step one, and they also tended to correlate. So it's probably just because we're looking at a student population that just happens to be very diligent with their studying. So it's probably a little
Right.
biased, but um, it's always good to keep up with your tests, your schoolwork. Um, let's see. Yeah,
I
those
have
are
a
like
question
the
about
real big
first aid
points.
too. You have a question about first aid because, when I was in medical school, I didn't buy first aid my first year. I didn't get it until second year. A lot of students that we talk to nowadays are getting first aid as soon as they start, and they're trying to review and annotate along the way. Is that something that, based on your studies or research, you found one way or the other to be helpful or not?
Yeah, for annotation you're talking about.
Yeah, even just reviewing it so that you're familiar with the text, because a lot of, every school teaches differently, and whether they're using, PowerPoints or lectures or whatever, the course content is that you might get at your institution, understanding how that translates into what you see in first aid, which is really going to be the boiled down, consolidated list of core facts that you need to know.
Hmm.
Um, typically what you're learning in school is going to have a lot more information surrounding it. So just reviewing it so that you familiarize yourself with it, and then definitely annotating things if necessary. Is that
Yeah, so I do recommend,
helpful? Not
yeah, during second year, I definitely recommend going through using first aid with your classwork when
okay.
applicable,
Yep.
um, but not going crazy with it. If you're focusing on your test work, focus on what you need to know, um, and look it up in first aid if it's there, but then don't get sucked down the first aid, wormhole and lose focus of the test you're studying for school. In terms of first aid, like during first year, uh, we never really talked about that too much, but personally, I would probably stay away from that just because it's a lot of content that
Okay.
you're not going to really have any exposure to yet during first year, maybe towards the end of first year, but I wouldn't stress too much about step one during your first year medical school. I would just focus on your work and you'll learn most of what you need to know during second year.
How did you manage your time? Was there anything that you did, tips or tricks that you can convey for time management in medical school, studying for STEP, or just in general, to be as successful as you are? You definitely have figured something out. All of us feel like we never have enough time to take on what's in front of us. So do you have any tips there?
Yeah, I mean, it's really just about work-life balance, right? So it's about, um, you know, working as hard as you can and making the most of your study time when you're doing it, and then knowing your limits and taking breaks when you need them and making the most of those breaks. Um, and by breaks, I'm talking about, an hour break during studying as well as a weekend off or, a week vacation. So knowing when you need a break and knowing to take that break. And that's even more important during the dedicated study period because students get so worried and they're studying, 12, 14 hours a day with no breaks. And it's the easiest way to burn out. And you're never gonna study efficiently without taking breaks during the study period. So everyone will forget this by the time the study period comes, but remember to take your breaks. And then time management wise for med school, it's a lot of work. You just put in, I would
Uh-oh.
say for,
Lost you.
out again, come back in. Sorry about that.
There we
I would say for, January to March or till break, when anytime you're just doing regular medical school classwork,
go.
um, you want to be doing, probably 3 to 4 hours a day of just regular studying, and then maybe 30 minutes of step prep, and then ramping up as you go, but really focusing on your schoolwork, and then time management, and then the rest of the time you're just exercising or hanging out with friends, and then time management during the dedicated period, you're basically ramping up to 8 to 10 hours a day, probably like 6 to 10 hours a day, and then that'll vary based on the day, obviously. But you're trying to push yourself as much as you can within reason, and you're trying to take frequent breaks so that you stay motivated. And then you're also taking days off when you need it, and you're planning, little trips or whatever to keep you sane and focused. So yeah, but time management is definitely super important.
So, any last thoughts on step one studying prep and how you absolutely nailed that test?
No, we covered all of it. I mean, I'll quickly just, list the goals one more time just so everyone has it
Please do.
succinct. So basically, as much as you can, try to get these, but don't drive yourself crazy, and always have some me time and have some break time to keep yourself sane. So studying in January, prioritizing UWorld and trying to get through it twice before exam
Mhm.
time, getting another question bank in and doing as much of that as you can. After you feel comfortable with UWorld, more questions is better. First aid, as much as you can, getting through that, and having some kind of audio or visual resource to listen to during your downtime, and then keeping a study guide as you go to have constant refreshing of all the stuff that you're definitely going to forget.